And now let's take a look at that chain that was created. And I'm actually going to go ahead and zoom in so we can see these nodes a little bit better. And I'm just right mouse clicking to pan our view. And we can see what we have is our color map node. Connected to that is a filter, which currently is doing nothing, but is there as sort of a placeholder. And then we also have a constant number. And this constant number is also a placeholder and is currently not affecting any part of our color map. Now what we can do is use this constant and replace this with what we want to use to control our gradient and how we create our color. So I'm just going to zoom out, make sure our constant is selected, and now we can go up to the left and either add and replace this constant node with a noise node or a fractal node. And I'm going to replace this with a fractal. And with this fractal node, we now have the ability to control how our gradient looks on the surface and how it is dispersed throughout. And what I'm going to do now is open up that function output observer, and we can really take a look at the surface that's being created. Now, because of the scale of our current fractal, it's quite large, and it's going to be difficult to actually see our overall gradient. So I'm going to reduce the wavelength size to 0.2 on all of our axes. And if we take a look in the preview for our actual fractal, we can see with that black and white image how it is being dispersed. And what's actually happening is the white areas of our fractal are showing up, if we take a look at our color map, for the right side of our color map, which is our brown color, and the left side is our green color. And if we take a look at the fractal, we can see that those are the black areas and the darker areas. And then everything in between is going to be the blend between these two colors. So the more colors we have, the more we're going to see them showing up in this fractal and how our overall preview and material is generated. So let's load in a different color map. I'm just going to right mouse click and go to load, and we can select any one of these maps. And basically we're looking for a gradient because there are solid colors available, but then we're not going to have any sort of variation whatsoever. But we can use terrain editor maps, we can use the skies, we can use any of these because they're all compatible with our color maps. We're going to go into rocks and grass though, and I'm going to select our desolate and click OK. And now we can see this material showing up as our color. And now any settings we make and change for this simple fractal are going to affect how we view the color. So I can change our wavelength again, and let's bring us down to 0.1. And now we can see we have the surface showing up with a lot more detail. And we're actually viewing this at half size, but we can see a little bit better than the overall material and color that's being created. Now within these fractal nodes, we have a variety of different options. If we take a look, we can adjust the wavelength, we can adjust our origin. We also have a largest feature option, and this adjusts basically our largest feature, the largest area that we have. And if we take a look, that's basically going to be our white area. And basically it's asking us, the largest white area, how big is that going to be? And how big can that be? And we have that currently set to 10. If I decrease that value, we're going to see a lot less of the overall white area and more of a gray. If we increase that even more, we're going to see a lot more definition in that white color. So we can make changes that way to adjust those settings. We also have the same thing with the smallest feature, which works on the lower parts. And we can see that sort of grain showing up. And then we also have a roughness. And if I increase our roughness, we can see what that actually does to the node. But then if we take a look at the color and the output, we can see it even better. And we can see all these little details within our material. and that's all being caused by our overall roughness. If we decrease our roughness all the way, we're going to end up with a very smooth surface because we really don't have any detail. I'm going to bring that back up to 0.5, which is our default. And if we take a look, we also have a gain option. As we increase our gain, we're basically increasing the overall contrast of this fractal node. So now we can see either one color or the other with a tiny little bit of a blend around the edges. And if we decrease that, then we're going to start to see more of an even distribution, and we end up with a gray fractal, which is going to show us more of the middle of our gradient. So the more intense of those colors we want to see, we can just adjust our grain, or our gain. Now, with fractal nodes, there's a lot of different options you can choose from. Currently, we're using a simple fractal. And if we take a look, we have a lot of different fractal options. We have basic repeaters, fast Perlin fractals, variable roughness fractals, variable noise fractals, 3 noise, and then also open ocean, which is used to create with procedural terrains in order to create an ocean effect. We're going to stick with a simple fractal right now, but we can easily use any number of these to control these different settings. And by changing that back, we can see we have reset our current wavelength options. I'm going to bring those down to 0.2. And we can also change the overall noise. Right now, we have our noise set to Perlin Noises Gradient. But if we open this up, we can see we have a very large amount of different nodes to choose from and different noises to control exactly what it is we're creating. So we can take a look at some of these. Let's take a look at chipped, and now we can see the overall effect that that node produces. And as we adjust our different settings, we can increase our roughness and increase or decrease our gain, and we can see our gradient moving in and out of that specific node that we have set. We can change this to math patterns, and then let's select sine wave. And now we can see a new pattern showing up. And the best way is really just to take a look at the preview for the actual node, and then you can tell what's being created and how that's going to affect our gradient. We can go to flat patterns, we can select clumps, and now we can see that showing up. We'll decrease our gain. We can increase our roughness, and now we can see that overall effect where we have little patches here and there controlling the overall color. So we can use both noise and fractal nodes for this. And now the major differences between our noise node and our fractal nodes are the amount of detail that's created. Let's go ahead and just click in here to get that red box, and we're going to add a noise node. If we take a look at our noise node, it gives us a direct access to all of the different noises that we have available, just as we did within the fractal. But we also have very limiting settings because of that. We can adjust our scale, our wavelength, and origin, whether or not we'd like to be a rigid surface, and in this case we also have an animated option, which we can also access through this if we have an animated option. We go to Perlin Noises Value, so we want to replicate that, Perlin Noises Value. And if we click on Edit, we can see we can select that animated and rigid option. Close that out. And go back to our noise node. But basically with a noise node we see that there's really not as much detail as you can get with a fractal. And the noise node is pretty much the base in which a fractal calculates itself, but it adds all of these other options that give us the roughness, and basically a noise node is a fractal node with absolutely no roughness, and of course without our other settings like largest feature and smallest feature. But we can adjust our scale, and we can see that. But we have an overall just very blurred surface, really not a whole lot of definition. So whether or not you actually want to use that to control your color node is really dependent on what you're creating. So if I go ahead and attach our filter now to this noise node rather than our fractal, we can see our color output is more reflected on that noise, which is a very overall blurred surface. And we can increase the value, and we take a look and we see a lot of smoothing. So, like I said, it really depends on what it is you want to create. So we can go back and we can select this connection from our noise, bring this over to our fractal, and let go, and now we have that connected back to our fractal. And I'm just going to delete our noise node. And if we click back on our fractal, we can see we have a filter option. So we can create a specific filter for this node to adjust our color. But we also currently have a filter in between our fractal and our color map. So we could also use any one of these specific filters to modify our color. And we'll be getting a little more in depth with actually creating specific functions a little bit later, and as we sort of move through all of our different settings. But for the meantime, we're just going to keep these settings for our color, and we're going to move on to the next option. So I'm going to click OK, and we're going to stick with these settings. And if we take a look at our terrain, we can see that showing up, and we can see that overall material. And we may want to change the scale. What I could do is just bring that down to 0.5, and now we can see it a little bit better. So we're going to move on to our bump tab and our bumps. And we have our bump production, and to the right of that we have displacement mapping. And we'll get into that displacement mapping in a little bit. First, let's just take a look at our overall bump production. Bump production gives us basically the same values that we have with our color and alpha, except that we also have the ability to add depth, which is the overall effect that we'd like to have of the illusion of bumps. Because what bump maps do, if you're not familiar, is they create the illusion of depth on our surface. So rather than actually moving the geometry, which we can do with displacement mapping, a bump map will use a grayscale image, whether it's from an actual image map or a function that we create, to generate the illusion of extra geometry and definition in our model. So currently we don't have a bump map on our terrain, and we're just seeing a very smooth surface, and there's really not a whole lot of definition. We just have our base color. So let's go ahead back into our function editor and take a look at the bump option. So I'm going to right mouse click and go to edit function, and bring back our function editor. We can reposition this. And now we can create our bump in the same way we created our color, except that we don't need to use a color map node. We can just directly use our fractal or a noise node, because what we're looking for is to create that black and white image, and that is being created currently by this fractal node. Now what I could do if I wanted these to specifically match up is that I could actually go down to our output node of our bump and connect it directly to that fractal. And what that will do is match us up entirely. So our actual bumps that we're creating are directly related to where the color is positioned. And that's one way we could just easily create that sort of a bump map, just by directly connecting that. But we could also add filters in between so that we can modify it, or we can combine it with other types of materials and other nodes to make connectors to actually create a variety of different amounts of depth. Or we could just create a brand new fractal. So I'm going to click on this connection and just delete that. We're going to select our bump and go up to the side and add a fractal. And now, because we had already created this previous fractal and we had that selected, when we added a new one, it's actually using the exact same settings, and we have just as if we copied and pasted it over. So we can see the same sort of an effect, but now that we're separated, we can specify exactly what we want these bumps to look like. So if I want, I could decrease our wavelength, because right now this is currently a very large surface. I'm going to increase our roughness, and now we can take a look at our preview and see by increasing our roughness we're creating the overall dramatic effect of those bumps. We could also increase our gain so that our higher sections and the white areas are going to be a lot higher than, of course, our black sections and our lower colors. But what we could also do is change the overall noise. So we can go to cellular patterns, we can select Voronoi, and now we can see the effect of that bump showing up, which is a highly detailed bump because it is the Voronoi tessellation. It's a very neat fractal node and it has a lot of different geometry types in it. We can decrease the roughness for that, because for this specific bump, we're not really going to need all that much. But now we can see the illusion of that depth and the illusion of geometry. If you look at the edges of the object, you don't see any change, but on the actual object itself, it does look like there is extra geometry. So we can click OK and take a look at our preview, and now we can see both the bump map and our color map creating this terrain. So let's go ahead and just render this out. Final render, render to screen, 800 by 600, and let's just take a look at this current terrain. So we can now see that Voronoi noise that we selected on our overall terrain, and we still have large color patches because really the settings that we have for that color aren't really going to look good for an overall terrain, and we would want to adjust that. But we can see for the bump, we just have a really nice looking material, and if we wanted to, we can combine that with different nodes, edit that however we want. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. If we take a look at the bumps again, we can see we have that depth option. If we go back into the function editor, we select our bump and our fractal, we can take a look and modify these changes, maybe increase our roughness if we wanted something a little more defined. But if we still felt that our deepest parts of the bump that we're creating and the illusion of depth isn't quite deep enough, or maybe we wanted it to be just a little more subtle, we can adjust this overall depth. Or what we can also do is adjust our filter, and we could pull down this right side, and what that will do is basically constrict the amount of information and the amount of depth that we're creating. And we can see that in our preview on the left. If I bring this down really far, we're barely seeing that bump at all. If we bring that all the way up to the top, then we can see that full extent. We can also adjust the overall bump scale and the size of our function that we're creating independently from our other functions. We have that located on the bottom. So if we want to make that a little bit smaller, we could just change our scales. If we wanted to skew it a little, we could make one higher than the other. And then to the right, like I said, we have displacement mapping, which will actually change the geometry based on our bump map, but we're going to take a look at that a little bit later. So let's move on. We have our Highlights tab. And highlights are our specularity, or our illusion of certain specular effects. If we go to Highlight Global Intensity, we're going to have the ability to actually adjust our overall highlight. And if we increase that, we can see those highlights showing up on our material, where we have very bright areas. And underneath that, we have the Highlight Global Size, so we can either make it a very dull effect. So if it was a surface that isn't entirely smooth and it has a lot of diffusion, then you're going to want to use the dull setting. If you're working with something more like glass or plastic, you're going to want to bring it up to the shinier setting, which is going to make the amount of that specular that we see a lot smaller than it is when it's dull. And we also have anisotropic highlighting, which allows us to sort of skew and adjust the overall placement and sort of the overall shape of that highlight that we see. And since we're seeing basically just small round bits, we can change this from a lower value to a higher value. And now we can see the area in which it's affecting our specular. We can just see a sort of, we have a ring, and the more we increase that, the more definition we're going to see for that overall sort of ring. We can bring that down, and then we have an even distribution throughout the entire surface. We also have the ability to adjust our color. So if we wanted this color to be not white, which is our current setting, we could either create a custom color map or load in a color map. But what we can also do is drive this with a function. And if we select this area right here, it'll open up our function editor. And now we can see that our highlight has a constant color selected to it. So this constant color we can either define as a separate color, but basically that's the same as doing it within the material editor. But if we wanted to, we could actually link this to our color map node. So we could take this off, adjust it to our color map, and now our color highlights are going to be exactly the color of our surface. And instead of it being white, as we had with our constant color, it's going to match up with this color map node. So we can click OK, and now instead of our highlights being white, they are the exact color of our actual terrain. And then the more intensity we create, the lighter of those colors, and that's what we're really going to see. And our last option is our variable highlights. If we go ahead and select that, we're going to end up with another function. And this way we can adjust our overall highlight and whether or not we want it to show up in some areas and not in others. And we can also use functions to control that, whether we're using a fractal node or a noise node. And then also we have filters for adjusting the intensity and the size. And then we can also adjust the scale of the highlight function, so the overall separate scale, just as we have with all of our other options. If we right mouse click on this and go to edit function, you can see we have a highlight node, which is different from our other highlight, because this one's specifically our highlight color, and this one is just the highlight itself. So what I could do is just select our highlight, and we can add a fractal node, and now only areas that are showing up in the white area of this fractal are going to be highlighted the most, or at 100%. And the areas that are showing up in black are going to be 0 amount of highlight. So let's go ahead and change our filter size to 0.1 on our wavelength. And we can increase our gain and decrease our roughness. And now you can even see with our output that we have some areas that aren't showing up as highlighted and other areas that are. And that's all controlled by this specific fractal. We can also use image maps to control the amount of highlights and where they're going to be. And we can also make direct connections to other nodes. So let's say I wanted to use our color production node that we have. And because of the way our colors are set up, we could have it, since our darker areas are more towards the green, and our lightest area looks like it's completely brown. So what we could have is just those brown areas showing up as a highlighted area, and the highlighted color, the max amount, and the rest of those areas could be not showing up with highlights at all. In other words, they just appear dull and not as if they're reflecting any sort of light. And instead of creating an entirely custom node for this, if we want to adjust, we could just add a filter. And then with this filter, we can adjust basically whatever function we want. I could set this to gain, and that way we could either go one way or the other, and either it is specular or it isn't, instead of all the gray in-between values that we have with the normal fractal. So we could just have a filter in between our highlight and this node, and this filter won't affect any of our other settings. And let's just go ahead and disconnect our bump right now. Just going to remove that line. And we can take a look at the preview. And we can see that showing up a little bit better. And what we can notice is that those brown areas and the brown colors are highlighted, and that the green areas and some of those other areas don't have any highlight at all, because normally we would have an overall highlight on this object, and instead we're only highlighting specific colors. So that's directly connected to our color map, and there's just some really neat stuff we can do with it that way. Same thing with our bump. If we reconnect that, then you can see it a little bit better, because then we're offsetting our surface that way. Where now we can see the raised up areas are going to be the highlighted ones, and our lower areas are not highlighted, almost like if surface was chipped away. And now going back to our bump, since I've disconnected our other material, but we still want that sort of a look on there, what we can do is use a combiner node. So if we move over here to the left, we can see we have this little Y shape. I can click on that, and that's going to give us a combiner node. And I'm just going to go ahead and move some of the stuff out of the way so we can see it a little bit better. The current option is set to Blender, and we can see we have a new arrow on the top, so we can connect that to our other fractal that we had created. And now what we're doing with this node is blending these two functions together. So we have both of these fractal nodes combining together to create one bump, and then we can use that in our overall scene. And that way we still have some of those higher raised areas from our main fractal that's connected to our color, but also extra little details that we're adding on top of that. And if I wanted to, I could either use the filter built into this node, or I could click on this line and we can add a new filter, change that to a regular filter, edit that, and we can bring down that right side. And that way, we're not overwriting too much of our definition, and we can still see that overall bump. So if we take a look, we can see those higher areas that are now highlighted. We also have both of those bumps being connected. And if we go back to our Blender, there's also a couple of other options we have available. We can either blend them, or we can use some of these different modes to blend them. We can use the multiply mode. We can take a look at that. And now we can see that overall effect showing up. And these are very similar to the different modes that are available in a lot of image editing programs. We have multiply. We can also subtract the surface from there. We can also add on top of it. And now we can see that. We can select the max value, the minimum value, or we could just go back to the default of blend. And with our Blender, we have a ratio option, which allows us to select which node we would like to have more dominant. So if I move this to the left, we're going to start to see that first input, or the one that is controlling also our color, that is going to be the more dominant. If we bring it more towards the right, we can see more of our second input. Now we can also control that value with other fractal nodes. We can see we can extract the ratio, but that also brings us back to this setting up in the upper left. If we take a look at the right of our node, and I'm just going to zoom in, we can see a little line sticking out. And this is actually representing our ratio. So if this is turned off, we don't see any of those lines, and the only way we can extract these values is by actually clicking on the extract parameter button. If this is turned on, then we can see all of the different options that we have the ability to connect other items to. And currently, if we take a look at one of the fractals, we can really only see one, which is wavelength, but the other ones will show up if I just extract one of these parameters, delete it, and now we can see all of these different abilities to extract. If we go up to the top, we have wavelength, and then we have origin, and our largest feature, smallest feature, and these can all be connected to other nodes without having to use the extract parameter. So what I can essentially do with this Blender is adjust our ratio, black and white, by using another node. I could connect our ratio to this other fractal that we created. So now we're blending these two materials together with a ratio that's dependent on this specific fractal. So instead of them overlaying directly onto each other, what we have is one node showing up in the white areas and another node showing up in the black areas. And that's just another way we can control that. And there's also a variety of other combiner nodes we can use. We can use combiner, color combiner, add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And these are more direct values, the add through divide. But our combiner and color combiner do not have the ability to use the ratio option, but we can combine more than two nodes that way, and then adjust which ones are going to influence the other ones the most. So let's just go ahead and click OK, and OK again, and we can take a look at our surface showing up on our terrain. And with this fully rendered, we can easily see all of the different options we had set. You can really see that specularity in those brown areas, and the rest of it where it's dull and there's no specularity. We can also see that distribution of our bump map, where we have it extremely bumpy in some areas, and then we're really starting to take a look at the other bump in our other areas, and that's really dependent on all that node and that function, that fractal we created. So we can see everything overall and how it blends together. So let's move on and take a look at our other settings. I'm going to go ahead and just close this. We're going to double click and go back to our Advanced Material Editor, and our next tab is our Transparency tab. And now what we actually want to do is use a different surface for this. Instead of the material we're currently working with, let's go ahead and load something else in. And what I'm going to do is just load in water. By going up to the top, right mouse clicking, and selecting our first option, we can add a bit of water to the scene, which by default is transparent. And we can take a look at some of those values, and what's actually causing some of these different effects. So we'll double click on our water surface, and we'll take a look in our Transparency tab.